There comes a moment in nearly every human life when the ground beneath your feet starts to feel less solid than it once did. The world keeps spinning, people keep moving, schedules keep filling. Yet somewhere deep inside, a voice begins to whisper questions that refuse to be silenced. These aren't the practical questions of everyday life. What to have for dinner, or which route to take to work. These are the questions that shake the very foundation of who you think you are. Why does any of this matter? What is the point of all this effort? Who am I really beneath all these roles I play? Unsettling period of profound questioning and reevaluation is what philosophers and psychologists have come to identify as an existential crisis. Clinical term barely captures the raw, visceral experience of having your entire sense of purpose called into question. When this happens, it doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warning. It creeps in slowly, sometimes crashes in like a wave you never saw coming. You might be going about your ordinary day, sitting in traffic, standing in the shower, lying awake at 3 in the morning, when suddenly the routine you've been following feels hollow. The goals you've been chasing seem arbitrary. The identity you've constructed feels like a costume that no longer fits. Everything that once felt solid and certain now appears fragile and questionable. The comfortable narratives you've told yourself about who you are and where you're going begin to unravel, thread by thread, until you're left staring at the raw fabric of existence itself, wondering how you ever believed those stories in the first place. This experience of profound disorientation is deeply, fundamentally human. It's not a sign that something has gone wrong with you. Certainly feels that way when you're in the middle of it. It's not evidence of weakness or failure or some kind of psychological defect. Rather, it's a natural response to the complex reality of being a conscious, aware being navigating a world that doesn't come with an instruction manual or a clear sense of inherent purpose. We are, perhaps uniquely among all creatures, cursed and blessed with the ability to step back from our lives and ask whether they mean anything at all. And when we do step back and really look, really question, the answers we've been carrying often reveal themselves to be far less certain than we'd like them to be. The emotional landscape of an existential crisis is varied and complex. For some, it manifests as a kind of numbness, a flattening of affect where nothing feels as vibrant or meaningful as it once did. Colors seem duller, music sounds less moving, achievements feel empty. There's a pervasive sense of going through the motions, performing the actions of life without feeling truly present in them. Others experience it as acute anxiety, a racing mind that can't stop circling the same impossible questions, trying desperately to find solid ground where none exists. Others feel a profound sadness, a grief for the loss of certainty, for the death of the simpler worldview they once held. And sometimes, all these feelings swirl together in an overwhelming cocktail of confusion, fear, and existential vertigo. What many people don't realize, what often comes as a genuine surprise, is that an existential crisis doesn't always arrive on the heels of tragedy or failure. We might expect it after a devastating loss, after plans fall apart, after dreams are crushed. And yes, those painful experiences can certainly trigger this kind of deep questioning. But there's another path to existential crisis, one that seems almost paradoxical, one that catches people completely off guard. Sometimes it arrives precisely when you've achieved everything you thought you wanted. You get the promotion you've been working toward for years. You buy the house you dreamed about. You find the relationship you'd been searching for. You reach the goal you set for yourself long ago. And then, in that moment of supposed triumph, instead of the lasting satisfaction you expected, you feel a strange emptiness. A voice inside asks, "This all there is?" This particular flavor of existential crisis is especially disorienting because it seems to contradict everything we've been taught. Society tells us that happiness comes from achievement, from accumulation, from reaching milestones and checking boxes. Get the education, build the career, find the partner, buy the home, raise the family. Follow the script and satisfaction will follow. But for many people, that script leads not to contentment, but to a peculiar kind of hollowness. The goals were achieved, the boxes were checked, and yet the promised fulfillment remains elusive. The external life looks successful, maybe even enviable. The internal experience is one of confusion and quiet desperation. What you thought would complete you has failed to do so, and now you're left wondering what any of it was really for. This doesn't mean your achievements are meaningless or that your life lacks value. It doesn't invalidate the joy you felt along the way or suggest that your efforts were wasted. What it means is something both more subtle and more profound. Your consciousness, your soul, whatever you want to call that deepest part of yourself, has outgrown the old frameworks of meaning. The answers that once satisfied you no longer do. The goals that once motivated you now feel insufficient. You've reached the limits of a particular map of meaning, and your psyche is demanding a new one. This is uncomfortable, certainly. It can feel like a kind of betrayal. You did everything right, you followed the rules, and still something is missing. This discomfort is actually the growing pains of consciousness expanding beyond its previous boundaries. You can no longer tell yourself the comforting stories about future happiness. I'll be fulfilled when I get the promotion. Doesn't work when you've gotten the promotion. I'll be content when I find the right person. Falls flat when you found them, and the existential hunger persists. I'll feel complete when I achieve this particular goal, loses its power when the goal is reached, and completeness remains elusive. The when has arrived, and still there's something unnameable that feels absent. This confrontation with the inadequacy of external achievement to create internal meaning is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of the existential journey. It strips away the easy answers, the simple formulas, the reassuring belief that happiness is just one more accomplishment away. Yet within this darkness, within this stripping away of comfortable illusions, lies the seed of something genuinely transformative. The old answers no longer work. You're forced to search for new ones. When the external markers of success fail to provide the meaning you crave, you have no choice but to look inward, to dig deeper, ask more honest and more challenging questions. What do I actually value? Not what am I supposed to value? What brings me genuine aliveness, not what should bring me aliveness? Who am I beneath all the roles I perform, all the expectations I try to meet? These questions are harder to answer than what do I need to achieve next, but they're also infinitely more rewarding to explore. Period of existential questioning, as painful as it is, can become a portal to a more authentic life. Many people who emerge from an existential crisis report discovering parts of themselves they'd long neglected or never knew existed. They find new passions that genuinely excite them, not because those passions lead to some external reward, but because they resonate with something essential in their being. They form deeper, more honest connections with others, having shed some of the masks and performances that once mediated their relationships. They make choices based on internal alignment rather than external approval. Develop a kind of courage they didn't possess before. The courage to live on their own terms, even when those terms don't match what others expect of them. This doesn't mean existential crises are pleasant experiences or that we should seek them out. The confusion is real. The pain is genuine. The fear is legitimate. But there's a strange gift hidden within the struggle. When everything you thought you knew is called into question, you have the opportunity to rebuild your understanding on a more solid foundation. When your old sense of purpose crumbles, you can construct a new one that's more aligned with your authentic self. When the meaning structures you inherited or absorbed from culture prove insufficient, you can create your own. This is terrifying work. Sure, it's far easier to follow a pre-made map than to chart your own course through unmarked territory. But the self-authored life, all its difficulties, carries a depth and richness that the unexamined life simply cannot match. What exactly triggers these periods of profound existential questioning? If you found yourself in this territory, if you've experienced that sudden vertigo of purpose and meaning, you might wonder why it happened to you. Why now caused this particular earthquake in your psyche? While everyone's journey is unique, certain experiences and life situations tend to act as common catalysts for existential reflection. These aren't the only triggers, but they're the ones that appear again and again in the stories people tell about their own existential awakenings. One of the most frequent catalysts is major life transition. Human beings are creatures of narrative. We make sense of our lives by telling ourselves stories about who we are and where we're going. These narratives provide structure, direction, and meaning. But when our circumstances change dramatically, when we step from one chapter of life into another, the old stories often stop making sense. Becoming a parent, for instance, is supposed to be a joyful milestone, and often it is. Also, a fundamental identity shift. The person you were before, with all their freedoms and routines and priorities, longer fully exists. You're now responsible for another human life. And this awesome responsibility can trigger deep questions about your own life, your values, your readiness for this role. Similarly, graduating from school, getting married, moving to a new city, these transitions are meant to be defining moments, stepping stones in the journey toward becoming fully ourselves. Yet they can just as easily destabilize our sense of self, leaving us wondering who we are now that the previous chapter has ended. Then there are the unexpected turns, the plot twists that weren't in the script you'd been following, has a way of disrupting our carefully laid plans without warning or apology. You lose your job, not because you failed, but because of forces beyond your control. A corporate restructuring, an economic downturn, bad luck. Suddenly, career path you were on vanishes and you're forced to reconsider not just your next step, but the entire trajectory. A relationship ends through betrayal or simply growing apart, and the future you'd been building toward evaporates overnight. You receive a frightening medical diagnosis, and suddenly the illusion of invulnerability shatters, confronting you with your own mortality in a way you'd been successfully avoiding. These curveballs force a reassessment. When the path you were on is suddenly blocked or destroyed, you can't help but step back and ask bigger questions. What do I actually want? What really matters? If this plan didn't work out, what plan should I be following instead? Or should I even be following a plan at all? Another common trigger is a more gradual realization, a slow building awareness that the path you're on, perhaps successful by external measures, feels increasingly hollow or inauthentic. Your career looks impressive on paper, your resume is enviable, you've climbed the ladder and earned the recognition. But somewhere along the way, you stopped enjoying the climb. That once challenged and engaged you now feels rote and meaningless. You go through the motions with competence, but without passion. Every Sunday evening brings a sense of dread about the week ahead. You catch yourself daydreaming about different lives, different choices, different versions of yourself who made different decisions. This isn't about failure. By conventional standards, you might be succeeding. Success without fulfillment is its own kind of failure, and eventually the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. The questions start small. Is this really what I want to be doing? But they grow larger. Is this who I want to be? Is this the life I want to live? And once those questions start, they're hard to silence. There's the experience of feeling like a passenger in your own life. Perhaps this has happened gradually. Slowly, you barely noticed it happening. Responsibilities accumulated, obligations multiplied, and somewhere along the way, you stopped making active choices and started just responding to whatever came at you. You wake up, follow the routine, check off the tasks, fulfill the expectations, collapse into bed, and repeat. Day after day, week after week, month after month. There's a kind of a momentum to this way of living that keeps you moving forward without ever really steering. You're going through the motions, performing the actions, but you're not present in them, not directing them. You feel powerless, directionless. You're watching your own life happen rather than actually living it. This sense of being on autopilot, of having lost agency and control, can provoke profound existential questioning. If I'm not choosing my life, who is? If I'm not steering, where am I even going? And perhaps most troubling, if I regained control, would I even know what direction I wanted to go? Grief and loss, particularly profound ones, can also serve as doorways into existential crisis. When someone central to your life dies or disappears, when a relationship that defined you comes to an end, when distance or change removes someone who felt essential, the meaning structures you built around that person can collapse. We often don't realize how much of our sense of purpose and identity is tied to other people until they're gone. Maybe you defined yourself largely through your role as someone's child, and then your parent dies. Maybe your identity was intertwined with being someone's partner, and then the relationship ends. Maybe you drew meaning from a particular friendship or professional relationship, and then that person moves on. When the connection breaks, you're left holding pieces of an identity that no longer fits together. You have to rebuild, sometimes from the ground up, and in that rebuilding process, you're forced to confront fundamental questions about who you are independent of those relationships. What matters to you beyond those connections, how to construct meaning that isn't entirely dependent on others. Any of these experiences resonate with you if you recognize your own story in these common triggers. It's important to understand that what you're going through isn't an ending, but a crossroads. An existential crisis is your mind and heart issuing an invitation, even if it doesn't feel like a particularly welcome one. It's asking you to pause, to step off the treadmill of automatic living, to stop running on autopilot and inherited programming, creating space, however uncomfortable for you, to consider what actually matters to you. Not what you've been told should matter, what worked for someone else, not what made sense at an earlier stage of your life, but what resonates with you. Now, in this moment, given who you've become and what you've learned, this questioning, this uncertainty, this discomfort, it's not pleasant. It's also not purposeless. It's the necessary chaos that precedes reconstruction, the tearing down of old foundations that makes room for sturdier new ones. Many people who've moved through existential crisis and emerged on the other side report that some of their deepest truths, their most important realizations, their most significant growth happened during those periods of emptiness and confusion. When everything you thought you knew is up for revision, you're free to discover what's actually true for you. When the old meanings fall away, you can find or create new ones that fit better. When the comfortable answers prove insufficient, you're forced to sit with harder questions, and often those harder questions lead to richer, more authentic answers. The darkness of existential crisis, terrifying as it feels in the moment, can be the darkness of the cocoon. Not an ending, but a transformation, not a death, but a metamorphosis. How do you know if what you're experiencing is actually an existential crisis rather than just ordinary stress or temporary unhappiness? There's no definitive checklist. Certain patterns and experiences tend to characterize these deeper periods of existential questioning. Understanding these signs can help you recognize what you're going through and, importantly, help you realize that what you're experiencing is a known phenomenon, something others have navigated before, some unique deficiency or personal failure. One of the most common hallmarks is constant, repetitive overthinking. Your mind becomes like a dog with a bone, worrying at the same questions over and over without resolution. Why am I here? What's the point? What should I be doing with my life? These aren't passing thoughts, but persistent preoccupations. Even when your external environment is calm, when there's no immediate crisis or deadline or problem to solve, your mind won't rest. You lie awake at night thinking in circles. You zone out during conversations, lost in your own labyrinth of questions. You can be sitting in a peaceful setting, surrounded by beauty, and still your thoughts are churning. This kind of obsessive mental activity is exhausting. Yet you can't seem to turn it off. Your mind is trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle, seeking certainty where none exists, searching for meaning that can't be found through thought alone. Overthinking often brings with it symptoms that mirror anxiety and depression, and sometimes it actually triggers full clinical episodes of these conditions. The constant questioning, the lack of solid ground, uncertainty about purpose and direction, all of this creates psychological distress. You might feel a persistent sadness that doesn't have a clear cause. You're not sad about something specific. You're sad about everything and nothing sad in some deep, existential way that's hard to articulate. Or you might experience dread, a sense of foreboding that hangs over everything, a feeling that something is deeply wrong, even if you can't point to what it is. For some, the primary experience is emotional numbness, a deadening of feeling where things that used to move you leave you cold, where you go through the motions of life without really feeling present in it. This isn't quite the same as clinical depression can certainly evolve into that. It's more like a flattening, a grayness, an absence of emotional color that makes everything feel slightly unreal. Another telltale sign is a profound loss of motivation. The things that used to excite you, that used to get you out of bed in the morning, that used to give you a sense of purpose or direction, they stop working. You look at your goals and feel nothing. You consider your ambitions and can't remember why they mattered. Without a clear sense of why you're doing anything, even small tasks feel heavy and pointless. Why clean the house when it will just get dirty again? Why pursue the promotion when achievement feels empty? Why make plans when nothing seems to have lasting significance? This isn't laziness or lack of discipline. It's the paralysis that comes from losing the thread of meaning that used to connect your actions to some larger purpose. When that thread breaks, motivation evaporates because you can't answer the fundamental question, why bother? This psychological and emotional weight often manifests physically. You feel constantly tired, not the healthy fatigue that comes from physical exertion, but a deep bone level exhaustion that sleep doesn't fully cure. You wake up already depleted. Simple activities require tremendous effort. Your body feels heavy, sluggish, as if you're moving through thick water. This isn't usually a medical problem, though it's worth checking with a doctor to rule out underlying health issues. More often, it's the somatic expression of existential exhaustion, work of questioning everything, of holding uncertainty, of carrying unanswered questions is genuinely draining. Your mind and spirit are doing heavy lifting even when your body is at rest, and that takes a toll on your physical energy. Many people experiencing existential crisis find themselves withdrawing from social connection. You start declining invitations, canceling plans, spending more time alone. This isn't because you're angry at anyone or because soul interaction itself is unpleasant. It's because you feel like a stranger to yourself. And when you don't know who you are, being around others feels inauthentic and exhausting. You're so preoccupied with your internal questions that making small talk feels impossible. You're carrying this huge weight of uncertainty and confusion, and nobody else seems to see it or understand it, which makes you feel even more isolated. So you retreat, pulling into yourself, trying to figure out what's happening without the added burden of managing social obligations and maintaining appearances. There's also a pervasive sense of being lost, of lacking direction or control. Imagine standing in a dark room where someone has rearranged all the furniture while you weren't looking. You used to know where everything was, used to move through confidently, but now every step is uncertain. You reach for light switches that aren't where they used to be. You bump into obstacles that weren't there before. You can't get your bearings. That's what existential crisis feels like. The maps you were using to navigate life no longer match the territory. The compass that was pointing you in a clear direction has started spinning wildly. You feel stuck, unable to move forward because you don't know which direction forward even is, yet also unable to go back because something has fundamentally shifted and the old way of being is no longer accessible. Times people respond to this overwhelming uncertainty and discomfort by seeking escape through substances or compulsive behaviors. Maybe you find yourself drinking more, using substances to numb the questions or quiet the anxiety. Maybe you binge, watch shows for hours, losing yourself in fictional worlds that feel more coherent than your own life. Maybe you throw yourself into work with manic intensity, or exercise compulsively, or shop excessively, or scroll social media endlessly. Anything to create distraction, anything to avoid sitting with the uncomfortable questions you can't yet answer. These aren't moral failures. They're understandable attempts to cope with overwhelming psychological distress. But they're also signals, red flags, indicating that something deeper needs attention, that the questions you're running from need to be faced. It's crucial to understand that experiencing these signs doesn't mean something is fundamentally wrong with you. An existential crisis isn't a pathology. It's not a disease that needs to be cured or a problem that needs to be fixed. It's a developmental milestone, a psychological and spiritual evolution, a natural part of becoming a more conscious, more authentic human being. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, it can be frightening and disorienting and painful. But it's not a flaw. It's a feature of conscious existence. It's what happens when you grow beyond your current understanding, when your soul demands something more than what satisfied it before, your capacity for meaning and authenticity expands beyond the containers that used to hold it. Think of it as a turning point, threshold between one way of being and another. You're being asked, whether you volunteered for this or not, step back from the automatic rhythms of life and consider what you truly want your existence to stand for. Not what you've been told it should stand for, not what would make others proud or impressed, not what follows some prescribed script, what resonates with your deepest, most authentic self. This is enormous work. It's no wonder it feels overwhelming. Most of us, for most of our lives, exist within fairly comfortable boundaries. We follow established routines, meet known expectations, pursue recognizable goals. There's safety in this. The familiar is comforting even when it's not entirely satisfying. We check the boxes, graduate, get the job, pay the bills, maintain the relationships. And often we do this while only partially present, not fully examining whether these are the boxes we actually want to be checking. We mistake motion for meaning, activity for purpose, business for vitality. And this can work for a while. But eventually, for many people, the unexamined life reveals its limitations. Routine starts to feel like a cage rather than a structure. The boxes start to feel arbitrary. Goals start to feel imposed rather than chosen. And then the questions come. If you're in that questioning space right now, if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed or empty or confused or all of these at once, the most important thing you can do is extend compassion to yourself. This isn't the time for harsh self-judgment or impatient demands that you just get over it or figure it out already. This is the time for gentleness, for patience, for allowing the process to unfold at its own pace. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not weak or deficient or wrong. You're experiencing something profoundly human. Millions of people have moved through before you, and millions more will move through after you. You're in good company. Even if it feels lonely right now, take this as an opportunity not to fix yourself, because you're not broken, but to discover yourself. Who are you beneath all the roles you play? What do you value when you strip away all the should statements and external expectations? Brings you genuine aliveness, not the fake aliveness of external validation or achievement, but the deep aliveness of authentic engagement. These questions don't have quick answers. They can't be solved with a pro-con list or a self-help book or a weekend retreat. All of those things might be helpful parts of the journey. They require sitting with uncertainty, tolerating not, knowing, allowing yourself to be in the questions without rushing to premature answers. Maybe what's happening is that life, in its strange and often uncomfortable wisdom, is telling you something important. Maybe it's saying you're ready, whether you feel ready or not, for the next chapter of your existence. Maybe it's saying the person you've been is no longer the person you need to be. Maybe it's saying the meanings that worked for you before need to be revised or replaced or expanded. This doesn't invalidate your past. It doesn't mean you were wrong before. It means you're evolving, growing, developing new capacities and new needs that require new ways of being in the world. The journey through existential crisis is not linear. There's no clear roadmap, no step-by-step process that works for everyone. Some days you'll feel like you're making progress, gaining clarity, moving towards something. Other days you'll feel like you're back at square one, more confused than ever. This is normal. This is how the process works. Growth spirals, it circles back. It takes unexpected turns. Trust that even when it feels like you're lost, even when it feels like you're going backward, something important is happening beneath the surface. You might discover things about yourself that surprise you. Maybe you'll realize that the career path you've been on, while respectable and secure, was never truly yours. It was what your parents wanted, or what seemed practical, or what you fell into without conscious choice. Maybe you'll recognize that relationships you thought were essential are actually draining you, keeping you small, preventing you from becoming who you need to be. Maybe you'll uncover passions and interests you'd long ago dismissed as impractical or impossible. Maybe you'll find that the person you are in private, when no one is watching and you drop all the performances, is quite different from the person you present to the world. And maybe that private person deserves more room to exist. These discoveries can be unsettling because they often require change, and change is hard even when it's change for the better. It's tempting to know something needs to shift and then not shift it, to see the truth and then quickly look away, feel the call toward authenticity, and then retreat into the familiar. This is understandable. The known, even when unsatisfying, feels safer than the unknown. But the thing about existential crisis is that it doesn't really allow you to go back to sleep once you've woken up. Once you've asked the big questions, once you've seen behind the curtain, once you've recognized the gap between how you're living and how you might live, it's very hard to know that. You can try to push it down, distract yourself, pretend it never happened, but it will keep resurfacing until you address it. Addressing it doesn't necessarily mean making dramatic changes overnight. You don't have to quit your job tomorrow, end your relationships, move to another country, or completely reinvent yourself in one bold stroke. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen gradually through small adjustments and incremental shifts. Maybe you start by carving out time for activities that genuinely engage you, even if they seem frivolous or unproductive. Maybe you begin having more honest conversations with the people in your life about who you are and what you need. Maybe you start making decisions based on internal alignment rather than external approval, even in small ways. Maybe you give yourself permission to not have all the answers, to be in process, to be uncertain while still moving forward. What's important is honoring the questions, taking them seriously, allowing them to guide you towards something more authentic rather than trying to suppress them because they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. The questions themselves are valuable. They're your psyche's way of directing you toward growth, toward truth, a more conscious and deliberate way of living. They're uncomfortable precisely because they're important, because they're pointing at something that needs attention, something that needs to change or deepen or expand. You might also find that you're not alone in this experience, even though it feels isolating. When you start talking honestly about your existential questions, you'll often discover that others have them too, that beneath the surface of everyday interaction, many people are carrying similar uncertainties and wrestling with similar doubts. We live in a culture that doesn't make much space for existential conversation. We're taught to project confidence, to have it all figured out, to move forward with certainty. Admitting you don't know what you're doing, that you're questioning everything, that you're lost. This feels like failure in a success-obsessed world. But the reality is that most people, at some point in their lives, find themselves in this territory. Most people have moments of wondering what it's all for, whether they're on the right path, who they really are beneath all the conditioning and expectations. You're experiencing something universal while it feels uniquely isolating, and that's one of the strange paradoxes of human consciousness. Consider seeking out communities or individuals who can hold space for your questioning. This might be a therapist who understands existential issues, a spiritual teacher or guide, a philosopher, a wise friend, a support group. It might be books and essays by people who've navigated similar territory and can offer perspective and companionship for the journey. It might be creative practices, writing, art, music that allow you to explore and express what you're experiencing without needing to have it all figured out. The point is to find ways to be with the questions rather than being crushed by them, have support rather than white, knuckling through it alone to normalize the experience rather than treating it as some shameful secret. There's also something to be said for the wisdom of not knowing, for the value of uncertainty, for the growth that happens in the spaces between old meanings and new ones. Western culture, and particularly modern Western culture, is deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. We want clear answers, definite paths, certain outcomes. We're taught to be decisive, to know what we want, to have 5-year plans and concrete goals. The reality of human existence is much more uncertain than our cultural narratives acknowledge. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't control most of what unfolds. The future is genuinely open, genuinely unpredictable. While this uncertainty can be anxiety producing, it can also be liberating. If you don't know what's going to happen, If the future isn't already written, then you have genuine freedom to choose, to experiment, to try different ways of being and see what fits. The existential crisis in this light is an opportunity to embrace uncertainty rather than fighting it. Instead of rushing to replace old certainties with new certainties, maybe you can learn to be comfortable, or at least less uncomfortable, with not knowing. Maybe you can develop a kind of intellectual and spiritual flexibility that allows you to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, say, I don't know, without anxiety, to make decisions without needing absolute confidence that they're the right decisions. This is a different way of being in the world than most of us were taught, but it's arguably a more honest and more adaptive way. Is uncertain. Meaning is constructed, not found. There is no one right way to live. Once you truly accept these truths, they become less terrifying and more freeing. Think about the people you most admire, the ones who seem to live with real authenticity and depth. Chances are they've been through their own periods of existential questioning. They've faced their own dark nights of the soul. They've wrestled with meaning and purpose and identity. And what emerged from that wrestling wasn't easy certainty, but earned wisdom. Not simple answers, but complex understanding, not the end of questions, but a better relationship with questioning itself. The depth you sense in them, the authenticity that draws you, often comes precisely from their willingness to face existential uncertainty and come out the other side not with all the answers, but with greater self-knowledge and courage. You can become one of those people. This crisis you're experiencing can be the crucible that transforms you from someone who lives on autopilot, following inherited scripts, to someone who lives with conscious intention, having examined and chosen their values and directions. It can be the passage from a life lived for others to a life lived for yourself in the deepest, most life-affirming sense. It can be the transition from seeking external validation to trusting internal wisdom, performing for approval to simply being yourself and letting that be enough. None of this means the process will be comfortable or quick. Transformation rarely is. You might need to grieve the life you thought you were going to have, the person you thought you were supposed to be. You might need to sit with the discomfort of not fitting neatly into any category, of not following any preset path. You might need to disappoint people who had different expectations for you, who wanted you to stay the same, who feel threatened by your questioning and growth. You might need to tolerate being misunderstood, being seen as weird or confused or going through a phase. All of this is part of the price of authenticity. And while it's not a small price, most people who pay it find it worthwhile. What lies on the other side of existential crisis, for those who move through it rather than getting stuck in it, is often a life that feels more coherent, more meaningful, more aligned. Not perfect. There is no perfect. Not without challenges. There are always challenges. Not without moments of doubt. Doubt is part of being conscious. But more genuinely yours, more authentically lived, more in touch with what actually matters to you. You might end up making significant external changes, or you might stay in the same circumstances but relate to them completely differently. You might discover new purposes. You might reconnect with old ones you'd lost touch with. You might decide that the search for capital P purpose is itself a trap, and that meaning can be found in simpler, more immediate ways. Matters most isn't the specific conclusions you reach, but the process of reaching them consciously, deliberately, honestly. What matters is that you're taking the questions seriously instead of dismissing them, that you're doing the work of self-examination instead of sleepwalking through life. You're willing to be uncomfortable in service of becoming more authentic. This willingness, this courage to face existential uncertainty and not look away, is itself a kind of answer to the question of meaning. How should I live consciously? Live honestly? Live in alignment with your deepest values, which you can only discover by looking inward and asking hard questions. Live with awareness of your mortality, your freedom, your responsibility for making meaning. Live with compassion for yourself and others, recognizing that we're all navigating the same fundamental human predicament of being conscious beings in an uncertain world. Existential journey is ultimately about coming home to yourself. Not the self you thought you should be, not the self others wanted you to be, not some idealized, perfect self, but your actual messy, complex, evolving self. It's about stripping away the layers of conditioning and expectation and performance until you find what's real underneath. Developing the courage to be that real self, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's scary, even when it doesn't match the script you thought you were following. And it's about constructing a life, an identity, a sense of purpose that emerges from that authentic self rather than being imposed from outside. This is hard work, perhaps some of the hardest work you'll ever do. But it's also some of the most important work. A life lived authentically, even with all its challenges and uncertainties, is simply richer and more satisfying than a life lived on autopilot. The difference is the difference between truly tasting food and just consuming calories, between hearing music and just processing sound, between being present and just being there. Once you've experienced W continueth at depth, that aliveness, sense of genuine engagement with your own existence, it's hard to go back to the shallower way of being. The questions that triggered the crisis become not tormentors, but guides, not problems to solve, but invitations to explore, not enemies, but allies in the project of becoming fully yourself. So if you're in the midst of existential questioning right now, know that what feels like falling apart might actually be falling together in a new way. Feels like losing yourself might be finding yourself. What feels like an ending might be a beginning. The confusion and uncertainty and discomfort are real and they're hard, but they're also potentially transformative. You're in the cocoon stage, in the liminal space between identities, in the fertile darkness where new growth begins. You can't rush it. You can't skip it. You can only move through it with as much courage and compassion and curiosity as you can muster. And on the other side, however long it takes to get there, you might find that you've uncovered something precious. Not a final answer to life's meaning, because there probably isn't one, but your own capacity to create meaning, to choose direction, to live deliberately. You might find that the crisis was actually a gift, though one you never would have chosen, because it woke you up to your own life, demanded that you become more conscious, insisted that you stop sleepwalking and start truly living. You might find depths within yourself you never knew existed, strengths you didn't know you had, possibilities you never considered. find that the self you were performing for the world was just one small version of who you actually are, and that the fuller version is more interesting, more complex, more capable than you gave yourself credit for. This isn't to romanticize the difficulty or pretend that existential crisis is fun or suggest that you should be grateful for the suffering. The pain is real and valid and not to be dismissed. But within the pain, within the chaos, within the uncertainty, there are seeds of transformation. There is the possibility of emergence into something more authentic, more alive, more truly yours. And that possibility, that potential for genuine transformation and authentic living makes the difficult journey worthwhile. Not easy, not simple, not quick, but worthwhile. That's the paradox and the promise of existential crisis, that what feels like death might actually be rebirth, that what feels like losing your way might be finding it, what feels like the worst thing that could happen might turn out to be one of the best. You can't see that yet from where you're standing now.